Welcome everybody. So I'm Caitlin and welcome to our last SAEON seminar for the year. So today we are joined by Tony Swemmer. So he is the manager of SAEON's Ndlovu node, and he's going to be sharing a little bit about some of the work that they're doing up near Mariepskop and that area, and like exploring what actually happens when some of the forestry ends and figuring out some of that long-term research that they're doing up there. So over to you, Tony.
Hi, thanks, Caitlin. Morning, everyone. Yeah, so we set up a project, even though we're the Savannah node. We have been working also on the Escarpment Mountains nearby, where there's a mix of ecosystems. So when you think of the Escarpment Mountains or the Drakensberg Mountains, I think most people would think of an image like this. This is a famous part of the Natal Drakensberg. These massive grass-covered mountains, maybe small bits of forest, and also importantly, lots of rivers, freshwater draining from them. Further north in the country, they might look a bit more like this, where you have a sort of savanna rather than grassland on the slopes, but still very open ecosystems, mostly grass-dominated, not tree-dominated. And of course, in the Western Cape, it's fynbos on the mountains, but those are also pretty open systems, not covered in trees. So that's what our Escarpment Mountains were like in the past, up till maybe 100 or 200 years ago. But in reality today, much of these mountains are actually look more like this, covered in plantations, pine or eucalyptus plantations for the forestry industry. They might look like this, where pine trees have escaped from plantations and invaded natural vegetation. They might look like this, where plantations have been removed and then invaded by other alien species. So you get shrubs and thickets of various other aliens. You might have areas where pine trees are invading, and even when you have fire, you get lots of pine seedlings. So you get this steady patch-like expansion. And of course, it's not only pines and eucalypts, wattle trees, especially black wattle, were planted
I think we have lost sound.
In fact, when you think about the Escarpment Mountains, they occupy a really small fraction of the terrestrial part of the country. You look at this map, that gray line more or less represents where the mountains are, but it's a very thin area. It's not much thicker in reality than what's shown on the map. But of course, we know that these areas in these ecosystems are really disproportionately important. They provide a huge amount of ecosystem services relative to the size that they occupy. Obviously, there's the biodiversity part. There's a lot of endemic and rare species that inhabit the mountains, especially the grassland ecosystems and the fynbos ecosystems. Those are some of the more well-known ones in the northern part of the country. Also plenty of plants, many endemic plants. And a lot of work has been done by South African botanists and ecologists in the past documenting that. And then, of course, there's the even bigger, perhaps, value of them is the water supply. So these are considered water towers or strategic water source areas. And many of those who attend these seminars regularly would have seen talks about the SAEON work in Cathedral Peak in Jonkershoek, which is very much about how important these areas are for freshwater supply in the country. Okay, so Jonkershoek and Cathedral Peak deal with areas in the southern half of the country, and areas that were specifically set up to test plantation versus natural vegetation. We don't really have a site that looks at these new emerging abandoned or alien infested systems. And also we don't have much from the north of the country at the moment. So that's what led us to set up a site in the Mariepskop area. So that's sort of on the border between Mpumalanga and Limpopo, shown inside the red circle there, along the Transvaal Escarpment. And that's just an example of how vegetation has changed in this area. So in the 1930s, forestry began in the area and fire suppression as well. And a lot of the area which was grassland or open savanna either got planted up by plantation trees or became invaded by indigenous forest or just suffered from bush encroachment due to the lack of fire. So quite dramatic vegetation change in this area and over much of the escarpment in the northeast of the country. And then what also really got our attention for the site was that there was some quite old river flow data available. The Department of Forestry actually began engaging on the river that drains the site called the Kaseri River back in the 1930s. I'm not sure how accurate this data is, the older data anyway, but it is from a standard water affairs gauging station, and you can see a dramatic decline in the annual flow, the discharge, from the late 1930s onwards. And the 1930s was when forestry began in the area. So this seems to be the pattern that has been described for many other areas where forestry leads to reduced river flows. Here it was particularly dramatic, and you can see that flows have remained really low since then. Okay, so that was the situation from the 30s to about 2000. And then in 2002, national government decided they were going to withdraw from forestry in the area. The area was run as a state forest for many years. And they essentially pulled out, and most of the plantations were left. They weren't cleared or rehabilitated. And the land was land claimed and now has been incorporated into a nature reserve. So it's now undergoing a second sort of dramatic change in cover and vegetation type. There's some sort of irregular, illegal, or not illegal, but unregulated harvesting of remaining plantations. But more importantly, fire has returned because there's no longer fire suppression by the foresters of the area. And so we've seen a nice natural experiment taking place. The site now which was predominantly plantation, almost all plantation with bits of indigenous forest, is now becoming a real mix of either remaining plantations or abandoned plantations that have burnt or those that have been cleared. And in some areas, even secondary grasslands and savannas beginning to form. So we've got a range of ecosystem types, and that's a very nice natural experiment to test the various attributes and functions of these new ecosystems in this area. And I think this is fairly representative of what's happening elsewhere along this part of the escarpment, and is probably going to be happening more in the future, because eventually forestry is likely to decline as it has in Europe and other areas. There's just another example of what it looks like now. So here we have indigenous forest, quite extensive naturally occurring indigenous forest in the foreground, and in the background there are areas that were plantation, but due to frequent fire have become a grassland. So it's an interesting dynamic area, and we don't really know what the endpoint will be for the various ecosystems. It's quite complex. You have a range of rainfalls because of a steep altitudinal gradient, a range of soil types. Areas differed in terms of whether they were planted with pine or eucalypt. And since the abandonment of the plantation, areas differ in terms of whether they were cleared and poisoned, or cleared and not poisoned, or not cut at all. And now with fire coming back, it's not in a controlled way. So the burn pattern is quite stochastic, and there's quite a range of burn frequencies emerging. So we have a whole lot of different pathways for different areas. And we would like to know, if depending on the history and the current fire, what ecosystem is likely to emerge in a given area over the coming decades. And that has important implications for biodiversity conservation, but also for the stream flow of the river, the Kaseri River that drains the site. So we decided we would develop a long-term research site here. The main goal is, as I mentioned, to try and understand what's going on with the regeneration of natural systems. These are essentially novel ecosystems because in many cases they don't resemble what was there before, certainly not in composition, although maybe in structure. And then we'd like to understand if the river flows are going to recover if vegetation goes back to the same structure as before, will river flows increase to the levels they were before. Okay, so for understanding the sort of ecosystem level change, we've set up a whole lot of vegetation monitoring sites. These are shown in the red dots here. The blue line down through the middle is the Claseri River. So its upper catchment is the bulk of the site, or the core of the site. Mariepskop Mountain is just towards the top of on the edge of the yellow line. And then the Claseri is sort of draining one slope of that. And then in addition to field measurements, we've been using remote sensing, high resolution aerial photography, as well as satellite imagery for mapping land cover in the past and currently, and for recent fire history. So looking at a coarse measure of vegetation type, which we did simply by classifying manually on historical aerial photos, it's clear that the plantations really took over from the 1930s to about the 1970s. There was a massive increase in the cover of plantations from about 20%. It was already at about 20% in the 1940s, and then up to about 70%. And then constant until forestry was abandoned around 2000. And you can see how grasslands cover plummeted, obviously, as plantations were planted into them. But we have seen a recovery from about 2000 with increasing areas now, secondary grassland. And in the blue, I've got what I call transitional. So these are areas that might be now sort of thickets or other alien species or juvenile plantation. So they're kind of a savanna or thicket ecosystem. And this is just an example of our fire mapping. So this is just for one particular year. And this was using also a high resolution aerial photography from the plane and just mapping out all the burnt areas. And we do this every year, and then we can create a fire history for the site. And in addition to sort of vegetation structure, we've started to look at plant diversity as well. So species level diversity. So we've got permanent transects laid out for structure, and then a whole lot of quadrats that we sampled once for plant species richness. And that's just an example of where all the sites are and different colors denoting different vegetation types. And this is intended to be a long-term study, so we're interested in the change over time at all these permanent monitoring points. But we could do some analysis just with the initial survey using the spatial variation to get some insights. Just as an example, quickly, what these different areas look like. So that's an area that was invaded by pines on the edge of a wetland. Not actually a plantation. You can see pine trees of a range of different sizes and very messy, not in ordered rows. And that's one of our vegetation transects going down the middle. This is a proper plantation, abandoned pine plantation, an area of eucalypt that's been cut but not poisoned, so a lot of resprouting eucalypts, but also a lot of grass and other indigenous species coming in. An area more recently cleared in a drier part that was also eucalyptus before. And then in the background, you can see the size that the eucalyptus trees actually get to here. It's quite a productive environment. And then some areas have actually become proper grassland again, like that. This was actually a eucalyptus plantation as well. Very little remains of the original grassland of the area. This is just one of our few benchmark sites. So this is a small patch of grassland that was left unplanted close to the forestry station at the site. So looking at a multivariate analysis of our vegetation structure data, we see some clustering as you sort of would expect. So the green dots are our grassland sites, the dark green are the primary grassland, and the light green are secondary grassland. And this is an analysis just done on basic metrics of structure, cover, and height, and so on, and then the dominant species. And then in the orange is a wide range of eucalyptus-dominated systems, and some of them more similar, sort of more open and more like grassland, and some of them still quite dense. And in the blue, the pine the system's dominated by adult pines. So you can see those cluster out quite differently. Also, sites where juvenile indigenous forest species are establishing, so an expansion of indigenous forest cluster with the pines. And then if we look at just a few coarse scale predictors of that, fire frequency really separates out the grassland from the pines. So when pines get burnt, they don't persist as pines. They switch to a grassland. So that's the kind of long arrow there. Aspect is also playing a role, with the pines only sort of persisting in the wetter south-facing areas. And then on the eucalyptus, it's very variable. So there's areas that get burned frequently that stay eucalyptus, and some that don't get burned much and are also eucalyptus. And they're also are covering a wide range of soil types, if you like, and aspect types. So the eucalypts are more difficult to deal with, and more persistent, and persisting in a wider variety of habitats in your site. Okay, so what about the diversity within these secondary grasslands? Secondary grasslands in this area, or primary grasslands rather, are really known to have very high herbaceous plant diversity, which is the case, throughout the escarpments mountains of Southern Africa. How many of these species, herbaceous species, are returning? One thing we have noticed is that bracken fern often dominates in the early stages of grassland succession, and that seems to suppress a lot of other species and prevents species recovery. So we found actually that graminoid species were not too bad. In the top graph, the grassland bar is the secondary grassland, and it has more species than the plantations or abandoned plantations, but not as much as the primary grassland, but not too bad. And actually the forb species were even better in the lower graph. The forb species were on average, above half of what's found in the primary grassland, which is not too bad, because forbs are normally the ones that don't come back in much abundance. So even in the absence of active restoration, there seems to be some natural regeneration going on and some recolonization by indigenous herbaceous species, which is very promising. Looking at the role of fire in that, there does seem to be some relationship in that the more frequently burnt secondary grasslands have more forb species, and that's not surprising either, based on ecological research done in primary grasslands. It doesn't seem to be the case for graminoid species, interestingly. And we also see that fire is not evenly distributed across the landscape, so the lower areas are burning more. I think that's due to cattle farmers burning on purpose, but also because they're drier and have more dry biomass at the end of winter. So the role of fire is not the same across the system, and we've certainly seen some confounding effects, which is always going to be a potential problem in a natural experiment setup. Bracken cover also, interestingly, is most common or at highest cover on south-facing slopes, and the drier areas that burn a lot don't have much, which is also kind of expected, but certainly suggests fire maybe needs to be more frequent to get bracken out of some of the wetter areas. All right, so for most of the remainder of the talk, I'm going to move on from vegetation to straight hydrology. So this was this was the second main aim of this project, was to understand how the hydrology is changing as vegetation is changing. So to that end, we started setting up weather stations across the site. We've actually only got one full weather station, but then we've got 5 standalone rain gauges. So that's in the top left is our weather station, which is close to the forestry station, where there's a nice historical data set, at least of rainfall. And then we spread out rain gauges to try to capture the variation in rainfall across the remainder of the catchment. In the top right, there's a surface renewal station that we set up with help from Michelle Tusha to measure evapotranspiration, which will help with understanding the hydrology in the future. So the little clouds here show where our rain gauges are, and in addition to that, we've set up level loggers in the stream so that we can get measures of stream flow, so we can try and track that those changes over time. That's more for feeding into hydrological models than actually tracking change over time, because that change is likely to happen so slowly. There is also still an active water affairs gauging station just downstream, just off the edge of this map. So for the data we've got so far, this is 6 years from 2019 to now. We see quite a variation in total annual rainfall. The highest point actually is not the highest rainfall. It's about 1,600 mils. And then there's a basin below that, which gets just over 2,000. So really actually high rainfall, especially for the northeastern part of the country. It's really high rainfall. And then quite a steep rainfall gradient going down. The figures in the brackets in the bottom right there, 1,210, that's from a historical data set at one of the other forestry stations. And then to the right, at the edge of the site, that rainfall's dipping down to around 600 or 700 millimeters. This is some work that Ratang Makoa's been doing. She's our postdoc hydrologist, and she took the historical flow data, and we wanted to see if there was maybe any signs of a recovery of flow since plantations were abandoned. So here she's got a flow duration curve, and it's essentially, if there was a recovery, the red line, which is the flows from 2004 to 2024, the last 20 years, should be starting to get substantially higher than the green line, which is all historical data from before that time. So we're not seeing that recovery yet. I think there's far too much of the catchment is still covered by old plantations or new aliens. So a better way, well, a faster way to try and demonstrate that there is going to be a recovery is to model it. Otherwise, we've got to wait decades and just see if it happens or not. So Ratang is working on a geohydrological model. It's very much a work in progress, but the first step is classifying the vegetation very accurately. So she's been doing that with Rian Lerm, our technician, and some colleagues from the ARC. So we now have a fairly accurate land cover classification that can go into a geohydrological model. Ratang's also been working on an isotope study to better inform that model. And this involves collecting rainfall, collecting stream flow. You can see Ratang in the middle photo there collecting a stream flow sample, and then also water from soil and from within dominant trees, and then extracting water for isotopic analysis. And that's it's a good way to understand where the rainfall ends up, how long it takes to get into streams, how much of it goes into boreholes. We also have 2 boreholes at the site now for collecting these samples. And then to understand where the trees are getting their water from, if they're using stream flow or soil water or deeper sources. So all very useful stuff for enhancing the modeling aspect. And then just to end off, we now trying to get into other aspects of biodiversity, not just plant diversity. So for a couple of years, we've been doing invertebrate and fish sampling. That's a colleague, Sean Ma, who's been doing that work for us, just at a few sites in the main river. And again, we're expecting to see as chemistry changes due to the vegetation change and as flows increase, that there should be some, there may be some improvement in the biodiversity of the river. And also more recently setting up camera traps to see what's happening, particularly in these secondary ecosystems that are emerging. Are we getting the associated fauna, at least the medium and larger mammals that we would expect to get coming out? And we're also very interested in what's making use of these sort of novel ecosystems where you've got resprouting, plantation trees or other aliens. We'd also like to get some acoustic samplers going up there on a long-term basis for birds. And one more result before I end off. This is also preliminary work. This was actually done by a colleague from the USA, Rachel Keane, who was doing it for a PhD. And she had a look at soil carbon stocks as well as the carbon isotopic values in the soil, just at a few sites, either under plantation or under natural grassland or under natural forest, indigenous forest. And what we wanted to check here, I won't go into the details of carbon isotope theory, but essentially grasses leave a different signal in the soil to trees. And so as you sample deeper down the soil, you can build up an idea, a picture of what the dominant vegetation was in the past. So you can see in the light green, at higher depths, closer to the surface, the soil signal clearly shows a grass signal for the grassland site. At some point in the past, that site was more woody, so perhaps it was more of a savanna. We don't know how long ago. That's probably thousands of years. But what we can also see is a shift in the upper soil layers for soil that is under plantations. It shifts towards the green, which is an indication that these plantations were indeed planted into either grasslands or savannas. And we also see with the forest sites similar shifts. So probably the areas where we sampled were relatively young forest, and that they kind of expanded out due to fire suppression. And then looking at total carbon stocks, this is obviously of interest to a restoration project, because some might argue that it's better to allow these systems either to develop into indigenous forest, in other words, keep fire suppression going, and allow the former grasslands to become forest for the sake of carbon. And certainly you would have more above ground carbon in that scenario, but would you have more below ground? And these results suggest you wouldn't, because the carbon stocks are very similar in the young forest sites and the grassland sites. Interestingly, they were actually lower in the pines. So pine plantations are not good for storing soil carbon or sequestering soil carbon, although the eucalypts apparently were quite. Right, just to wrap up then, the Mariepskop site is an area where passive restoration is happening at a large scale. Certainly takes time, and there's a role of fire, a beneficial role of fire, although we need to do more research to understand the details of that more. Certainly heading in a direction of increasing diversity, but we don't know how far that will go and what these ecosystems will eventually look like. And we're still busy with hydrological research. That model is a work in progress, and I'm sure there'll always be room for improvement on that. We'd like to get into the diversity of other taxa and explore the soil carbon dynamics as the site changes over time. So we're always looking for collaborators at the site. If you're interested, or you know anyone who's interested in any of these topics, you're more than welcome to let me know. And to end off, I've mentioned a lot of the SAEON staff involved here. Also many of our field assistants collected a lot of this data, Mati Mashele, and various academic colleagues over the years. But I'd also like to mention the Kruger Canyon Biosphere Region NPO, who got us interested in the site and has facilitated our access, and also often helps with the data collection. All right, thanks. I will end off there.
Thank you so much, Tony. That was a very interesting talk, and bringing together all the little bits and pieces happening in that area, which is quite a nice summary. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? So you're welcome to either raise your hand, or you can make use of the chat, but we prefer to hear from you. No one's got questions.
Yes, hello.
Oh, there we go.
Yes, hi.
Would you like to go?
Yes. Hi, Tony. Hi, Caitlin.
Oh.
I'm Sibusiso Dlamini. I'm currently at VET. I'm actually under Sivu Situngu with Hotato. So I was just wondering if are there any plans to pair some of these long-term studies or some of the monitoring in the sites with any soil biology related analysis?
Yeah, we would love to do that. We don't really have the capacity, but yeah, I mean, beyond the soil carbon, the changes in the soil microbial communities must have been pretty profound, going to plantations, and who knows what they're going to now. So we'd definitely like to support that sort of research. We don't have anything currently going, but it's, I think, an interesting question. We also do have a little bit of preliminary data on soil nitrogen and pH, which, you know, offers have changed quite a lot under plantations. So I think also just the soil chemical processes are really interesting. And also the soil, I didn't mention soil water sensors, but we have put some in recently. So understanding the soil water movements in the upper soil, I think it's going to be quite interesting.
Oh, okay. Great stuff. I'll push it through Dr. Steve, and then maybe we'll take it from there.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice chat. Nice talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sibusiso. Yeah, hopefully there can be some collaboration in future things. Anybody else have any other questions?
Hi.
Yeah,
Hi there.
you can go, Vaynant, and then I saw someone else unmuted. You can go next.
Thanks. Yeah, a really cool work, Tony. Thanks for this presentation. Have you considered doing any repeat photography work? I think it would be cool to be able to see sort of how the plantations came in and then now how they are being reduced and natural vegetation is coming back.
Yeah, so I've tried to get hold of older photos. There was a military base at the site for many years. And there is a sort of group of guys who used to be there, but not great photos for repeat photography, actually. I think once the plantations were in, you can't really take a nice photo because there's trees everywhere. And then the landscape level ones are generally too far. So we have a few, and we've also started with our own ones now to see them going forward for a few sites. Yeah, but I mean, it is really useful, and it's also great for explaining results and things when you can show photos.
Yeah, it's nice storytelling. And then secondly, when I looked at your ordination, have you considered taking other measures, environmental measures? So when you do your vegetation plots, for instance, looking at rock cover or soil type and cover or soil moisture, just to see how geology may influence. The reason I'm asking, I've seen in the Eastern Cape's Karoo, like there's quite a distinct difference between where thicket and fynbos occurs on the slopes, and it's usually related to geology. Obviously, in your case, I think aspect and fire will still be the strongest factors, but I'm just curious if you might look into other factors as well.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. We did measure rock cover, but what we don't have is good soil maps there, or soil classification. So that's what we really need. I think soil depth and then soil type at the various sites. So that's something that we need to do. And yeah, I agree. I think that's going to play a strong role. I don't know how much, a site might still go to secondary grassland with fire regardless, but then the species composition is going to be influenced by those things a lot.
Thanks.
Thanks, Vaynant. Aubrey, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I'm curious about how good your historical vegetation cover data is, whether you have access to historical records from the forestry people that were involved there, about what, like what percentage of the different parts of the catchment were planted up, because that might help explain some of the historical water data that you have, and yeah, I'll give you some ideas about what it might be going towards.
Yeah, thanks. So we do have some old forestry maps. A lot of them were lost, particularly during COVID. So a lot of the old forestry stations, they'd kind of been abandoned, but there was still maps in them, and then they just got looted and vandalized and stuff got lost. But we do have, for the more recent past, sort of forestry map showing what compartment is what. By then it was all planted up though. So it's the stuff like 1930s, 40s, 50s that we don't really know which area was planted when. We've got a bit from historical aerial photos, because at least there is one section that goes back to the 1930s, and then we've got a 40s and 50s, so that's pretty useful. Although you can't always see exactly what's and what life stage, I mean, what size the plantations are. But I don't think that really good forestry maps exist for those earlier days, unfortunately.
And no data about at what point in time different blocks were planted and so forth, so one can get an idea of the age of the vegetation.
No, unfortunately not.
Okay.
So this forestry fell under Laboa homeland from about the 1950s. So that normally all the forestry records is with Department of Forestry or archives there. So those years didn't make it into those archives when it all came back under forestry. So unfortunately, we haven't been able to track those down.
The joys of working with trying to get old data. Monique, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask, or a question you'd like to ask?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Swemmer, for that wonderful presentation. It was very interesting to see how your team tackled the rehabilitation aspect from all the different layers with the terrestrial as well as the aquatic side. My question is more from, in your presentation, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention that I'm also from Dr. Situngu's lab, working with the Khotato as well. And my question is more, when you mentioned the hydrology aspect of your presentation and presenting your results, you specified that you're looking at some invertebrates and fish species. I just wanted to check that you're also looking at the sort of soil dwelling insects as well, given Sabu's earlier question about the microbial communities, because I know that ground beetles and ants and termites as well also play a role in sort of that turning over of the soil, and I just wondered if you were interested in that as well.
Yeah, we're definitely interested in it, but not doing anything, and difficult to find people with that sort of interest and expertise. So maybe for your next postgrad project, you could come do a survey there for us.
Definitely interested. Thank you, Dr. Swemmer.
Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Are there any other questions? I see Sue has quite a nice comment in the chat that there's some convergences with the work that they're doing in Cathedral Peak, and it's quite nice to see that there's some similarities between things and stuff. So yeah, last chance. Go.
Sorry, I just yeah, I mean, Sue and I have spoken about comparing the catchment there that is the rehabilitated one. And that's definitely, I think, it will be interesting too, to see the plant diversity at least, and how it compares between two different systems that have gone through the same process.
Some new plans in the future. Cool. Does anybody have any other questions or anything they'd like to ask? Yeah, Johan?
Hi, everyone. Big Brother is watching you. Thanks, Tony. It's great to see how far you've come with that. I remember the visit with Albert van Jaarsveld and Patrick and others to Mariepskop. I actually don't know which year it was, but anyway, now we have lots of data, lots of thinking still going, and so on, experiments. That's great. What I wanted to ask quickly is, I'm aware of around the country there are volunteer groups hacking pines from natural vegetation where it's spreading and invading. So it seems that you say that fire can have a level of control over this infestation of pines elsewhere. Would that be true?
Yeah, I think it can if you can burn regularly. So, the pine adults will mostly die in a hot fire, and then you end up with a very barren landscape, and there's just an explosion of pine seedlings. And if the grass can come back fast enough, you can burn those pines before they produce cones again. because it does take them quite a while. So it can potentially happen, but also, you know, in many areas, if that fire doesn't come soon enough, then you just get a second generation of pine trees coming up. So definitely, I think the volunteer groups, they're not active in this area, though they are sort of just over the mountain in the Blader Canyon Nature Reserve. There's a lot of volunteer work going on there. So yeah, I think it definitely helps where fire, for whatever reason, can't be done frequently enough to sort of exterminate the pines.
Okay, because I mean, that's very labor intensive and costly to physically remove these things, and fire is actually a cheap tool. So,
No, exactly. I mean, you can't, at large scales, fire is really the only thing that can, you know, create this sort of transformation, especially with the decline of working for water in the area. The NGO we work with have got some really nice funding recently, so they've got a team busy clearing, but it's really a tiny fraction of the area.
oh, cool, thanks.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. And hopefully from this, there's some nice collaborations within SAEON and with other people out there. And maybe we can see some more seminars on the work that's happening in that area. So yeah, thank you so much to everybody for joining us today. And yeah, we hope to see you next year for our seminar, which will be on the 5th of Feb. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody.